Hello and welcome to NUPI. Good afternoon. My name is Morten Bøås. I'm a research professor here at NUPI, the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And welcome to this seminar on fragile states and taxation, evidence from Afghanistan, Liberia and Senegal, Sahel. Taxation has recently emerged as one of the most important issues in state building. And the reason for this is very simple, is that if you look at the overall literature of state building that has lasted for almost centuries, there's been a lot of emphasis on what states should do, what states needs to do, how they should do it, how they should improve the way they govern, how they should improve security, how they should improve their service provision to populations, and so on and so forth. But astonishingly, we have put probably way too little emphasis on how this is to be paid for, because states need resources to pay for this. States are supposed to protect borders. Then you need a military. That military needs to be funded. States are supposed to provide justice to its population. Then you need a police force, you need judges, you need courts. All of this needs to be paid for. And if it's not paid for, we know what will happen. We know that armies may create mutinies, soldiers may sell their weapons because they are not paid. Police that is not paid will have to find other ways of creating their own salaries. That is through corruption and other stuff. Judges who is not paid will then start taking fees from people in order to hear their cases, and so on and so forth. And how can then states mobilize these resources? Well, either they can rely on donor money, but that basically means that a state ties its destiny to an artificial international life support system that can be closed when something happens, like we have seen in the case of Afghanistan, which we will get back to. States can try to rely on simply tariffs and tolls on imports and exports, but that also leaves a state extremely vulnerable to whatever fluctuations happens in international markets, meaning that the only way that a state can have reliable income is through domestic resource mobilization through the form of some sort of taxation system. That can be tax on income, it can be tax on property, it can be other forms of tax, but it needs to be a system of taxation. And we believe that these debates needs to start also in the most fragile states in the world, because the only way that a fragile state can transform itself from the state of fragility, from a state of weakness, of poverty, is to start mobilizing resources internally. Because if not, that state becomes either dependent upon the goodwill of the international donor community, meaning that it will be forever tied to an artificial international life support system, or it becomes completely dependent upon tolls and tariffs on import and export. So the question is how this can be achieved. And we will today hear various evidence on the relationship between fragile states, state building and taxation from Afghanistan, Liberia and Senegal and the Sahel. And with me I have a very excellent team of researchers who originates from these countries. We have, in the case of Senegal and the Sahel, we have Dr. Abdul Wahab Cissé, who is a senior researcher at a regional Sahel think tank called ARGA, the Alliance for Rebuilding Governance in Africa, based in Dakar, but with important satellite offices in Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, and Cote d'Ivoire. We have Dr. Cissé has a PhD from the University of Bordeaux, and has published a number of articles in various international journals. We have with us James Shilu. He's the executive director of the Liberian think tank and non-governmental organization or civil society organization, Platform for Dialogue and Peace, P4DP. He has previously served as Liberia Program Coordinator for the UN Joint Interpeace Initiative, and he has degrees in community studies from both the UK and from the and an MMA in development studies from the ISS in The Hague. He's also a lecturer, senior lecturer at the Department of Sociology at the University of Liberia. And he's been working for more than 20 years within fields as of national resource governance, resilience, peace building, and conflict prevention. And recently is also involved in research together with colleagues here at NUPI and with ARGA on issues concerning taxation and state building in fragile states as Liberia and Mali. Then we have our good friend from SOAS, Dr. Sarajuddin Izar. Izar has recently delivered his PhD. He has a background from Afghanistan, also including working from the National Bank in Afghanistan, but is now based in London. And he works on issues concerning taxation and political settlements. And he will be speaking about the Afghan case. Finally, we have Dr. Joseph Simon Kiera, who is a senior lecturer in taxation and public finance management at Mzumbe University in Morogoro, Tanzania. He holds a PhD in management from the University of Hull and a master's degree in financial management from the Glasgow University. And he has more than 25 years of experience in teaching, research, and consultancy with a focus on taxation and public finance. So I think we have an excellent panel here to illuminate some of these immensely important but also very basic questions concerning how can an efficient and legitimate taxation system be started also in some of the most fragile and conflict-prone states like Afghanistan, like the Sahel. We get experience from Liberia, who has been through parts of this. I mean, Liberia was almost ruined by a devastating civil war in the 90s, early 2000s. Sort of slowly has sort of crept, it's been walking out of this, then being hit by the Ebola pandemic, and then starting to rebuild again with all the challenges it has been facing. And then we have Joseph, who will be commenting on these presentations from Afghanistan, from Senegal, Sahel, and from Liberia, based on his experience on state building and taxation in Tanzania. Because Tanzania has been somewhat of a front runner in Africa when it comes to rolling out a system of taxation. A system of taxation that has also been causing some controversies, and there has been critical points in it, but still Tanzania is seen as somewhat of a front runner in Africa when it comes to rolling out a system of taxation. So I very much look forward to these presentations. We are going to start with my friend Jim Shillo from P4DP in Liberia. That will be followed by a presentation by Dr. Abdul Wakab Sissé. Then we have Sarajuddin Izar, and then the comment, and afterwards we will have a debate, and hopefully you will all engage in it. We also have quite an audience online. I would like to tell that online audience that we can accommodate the digital questions. So please, Jimmy, the floor is yours. 10 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, good afternoon again. It's an honor to be here, and I'm very, very honored to be part of this very great discussion. Because I have 10 minutes, you please bear with me. I would try to do some surgical arrangement, and so when I'm skipping, please accept the fact. But we have time to do question and answer. I think Professor Boa could not put it better than he have done. the question about state building and peace building and the demand from citizens for social services, where also you have the point of accountability, transparency, and of course, taxation and all these things. When we conceptualize the idea of looking at these correlations, fragility, taxation, development, reflection, especially from the fragile state perspective, we were then challenged to see in our own countries what could be an ideal entry point. So I'm going to share with you some basic information. Consider that to be stimulant that we can use for the discussion. Can somebody flip the next page? Oh, this one, eh? Okay. So I will try to highlight the purpose of this experiment, the brief background, the overview of how the domestic tax regime works in Liberia in terms of mobilizing domestic resources. What approach did we use? The findings, or should I say some of the findings, conclusion, observation, and recommendations. So why we did this again, it was intended to understand the perception of people in certain areas of the country, because we would not be able to do a nationwide study without having some sort of a basic engagement. So we decided to start this engagement in a county called Magibi County. And Magibi was chosen primarily because there's a current pilot project around tax and decentralization, what is conveniently called 50-50. And I will tell you why it's called 50-50. So we just wanted to have an entry into this whole issue. So we took Magibi County. So 80% of what we did was done in Magibi and 20% was done in Monrovia, which is much rather. We also wanted to understand citizen perception if it comes to the issue of taxation. Keep in mind, I'm speaking in the context of a fragile state where trust level is very low. Again, the assumption is when we generate information from this entry, it will help to inform the larger study that we're going to hopefully do. So domestic tax mobilization in Liberia, I wouldn't bore you with the historical background of Liberia that, of course, was funded by the free slaves from the United States, 1847. As a matter of fact, Liberia is the oldest African republic. And at the abolition of slave trade, there was this whole desire to see how do you abolish slave trade. But at the same time, slave masters were prepared to strike a compromise, meaning we are prepared to let go of the slave, but they wouldn't live or cohabitate with us in the same community. So Liberia was then accidentally accepted as a kind of compromise country. Liberia stands for liberty. But 143 years was the period for which the former slave ruled the country. And painfully, if some of you have heard about the whole concept of black imperialism, it was a period where the oppressed has become the oppressor. And they constitute only 5% of the population, but they rule 95% of the population. That led to, from 1847 until 1980, when that, we call it hegemony, was being overthrown, and we have a kind of military leader who took over, and also did not help to seal the country. So there was a civil war that, in fact, really did not help bring about the kind of peace and build the country that we wanted to see. So the country relies heavily on natural resources for its development purposes. And there was also this reliance on external donors that we still do today anyway. That whole dependency syndrome is just part of our means of generating revenue. But what happened most times, you see the government going to the central bank and taking money that they wouldn't pay back, and that continued to cause some very, very turmoil into the financial banking system. We also see a government that has good policy, like we call the Local Government Act, that actually allows government to decentralize its policy. But what happens continuously is you have policy and you have reality. Rather than decentralizing the state, again, that a country that sort of imitated the system of the US that has a federal system, our system was inherited for the appeasement of the elite. We have a system that's supposed to be decentralized to allow counties or provinces to have some control over how they mobilize resources, but everything was done from the capital. So it's a centralized system. So when Madam President Salif became president, with some sort of a new arrangement, they have the good governance system to see how to reform the system. So there was an agreement through this act to decentralize. So there's a good provision to help decentralize the centralized system by helping to bring reform in the what we call our financial and revenue system. One of the very important areas that we see that sort of a reform was the separation of the Revenue Collection Bureau to be an entity, an autonomous entity by itself. The Bureau also really put into place so many measures to be able to help generate money and lessen its reliance on sometimes bureaucrats and corrupt officials. This studies and approach we use, as you can see, it was three-pronged. Dex review, we develop questionnaire, of course, with the technical support with our colleagues from NUPIC. We have both survey, and we have the focus group, and we have key informant. Of course, we use observational method as well. In terms of the demographic, you can see it there for yourself. The qualitative survey was 63 for real property owner agents, 26 to 70 in terms of age range in the county. Because we wanted to have some perspective for policymakers, we then did 20% in Monrovia, where the bureaucrats and the politicians are mostly based. Again, as I said, we use these approaches. Just giving you demographic. I don't want to bore you with this because, except for him, none of you know Liberia, so I can say anything to you, you wouldn't understand. So these are just an overview, but at least what is important for you to have a small idea in terms of our own attempt to be gender sensitive. And that's what I want to see, how you see the effort we made to include women as a way of understanding their own involvement within the context of the new system, a new 50-50 tax. Now, these are some of the findings that I think we can spend a few minutes on. When it comes to the issue of property ownership, the entire population we managed to speak to were 116. And interestingly, the question of property has to be contextualized. So we use what the Liberia Revenue Agency considered to be property, which is land, developed, undeveloped, rural, urban, semi-urban, and house, commercial property. All these things are considered to be properties. We also wanted to have an idea of what the average price of a property would be, both from the survey and the interviews we have with those people. So we're talking about the range of $2,500 US to $5,000. That's something in that range. And let me caution you, please do not use this as your place to go and start making your investment, because there are other conditions you have to accept. But what is important is that 9 out of 10 respondents admitted that they only declared their property value. When you're asking them how much what is your property value? And the reason why they only declare, it was clear. First and foremost, the researchers are now trusted. Second, the state has now been forthcoming in terms of meeting their needs, like you were outlining. Third, it's the fact that the state doesn't have the capacity to counter-check who is saying the truth or who is saying the false. Who is saying false. So I think the person who put it right to us that on evaluation of property is accepted, that the code you can see. He said individual self-declaration of real property's value is admissible by the Liberian Revenue Authority because the agency is challenged, okay, by limited institutional capacity to effectively conduct comprehensive property valuation in the country. So it was clear, it's a validation that, well, we accept what anybody tells us. We also observe that when we're talking in terms of property, the gender dimension, the question around that, more men answer to being property owner than women. Again, you will see why it's like that. However, the few women, women that participated in some of the discussion, that own property, there's some sort of a disturbing conditionality behind them being property owner. Mind you, the Constitution of Liberia says all Liberians are equal, irrespective of race, gender, blah, 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 blah. Yet, women becoming property owner, you either being the property owner by inheritance. That means you inherited the property from a kind of deceased husband. And even at that, the customary law can sometimes make you become a dispossessed property owner, except you are prepared to marry the brother, the cousin, or someone of your late husband, especially where you talk about in international chapter on human rights treaties that Liberia have also signed. So the Constitution forbids that, the international treaties forbids that, but sadly, that's a reality. When it comes to the compliance, the possible compliance and motivation, the question around when the 50% will be going back, the percentage of a respondent that was willing to pay if the government will actually do what it said. You see people were very much not 100% sure. So we had to tweak the question in terms of their motivation for compliance. So you found out that from both the focus group and the key informer interview, people have more trust if these things were being done at the local level. That one of the things we saw coming was strong. When you ask them further, how much tax they would be willing to pay should the 50% of the tax revenue flow back to the 69% say, we will be willing to pay, said that they will be willing to pay the amount that is due, with only 15% measuring what? They would consider paying a bit. Again, being ambiguous, not very clear. However, the evidence, there's just inability to provide basic social services, continuing to serve as demotivation or motivational element. So it means that tax payment will not just happen in isolation. There should be the whole issue of what you call the social, the contract theory, the social contract theory with state and the citizen has to be revisited. While 69% of the respondents agree that tax education and public sensitization were available, we recognize 76% expressed no willingness to comply with the tax willfully, meaning no matter what, there will be this kind of reluctance. So when we push the question again, some of the factors that will be impeding willful compliance, we've got issues like lack of what? Accountability, low incentives to pay, were listed as the most reason why people would not comply. The respondents were also complaining that because we have a centralized state and we have a history of decision of our lives and properties and everything being determined from the capital by people who are not close to us. Corruption, lack of accountability are problems, so we can't trust any new intervention. The governance system is more centralized, as we say. There's a need to decentralize it. You have to follow what is on the record. So even if you bring the best intervention, people will be skeptical. Emphasizing the centralization of the state, I thought one of the quotes that really bring to bear what is really obtained. It was a female shop owner who is a property owner. What do you call governance system? Nothing is being done here in respect to county development fund, except for what individual lawmakers carry out as development. They are clearly seeing what's happening on the local front compared to what we've seen to them. The administrator of hospitals and schools look up to decision makers, some of them to us, before they will do anything in the local, in terms of delivering their own services, and the decision makers are based in the capital. Thus, the 50-50 revenue sharing pilot is in twofold. First, it focuses on establishing the revenue sharing partnership agreement between central government and the local government of the county. The second is it focuses on training county officials to eventually carry out real property tax registration and collection. Okay? There you see 44% of respondents reported to have heard about this, because we wanted to know, do you know anything about this? Have they come to tell you? Yes. You see 44% reported to have heard about the pilot and could articulate what it is designed to achieve. However, when you ask them if this will be successful, the pilot will encourage tax compliance. Again, we see the kind of number passing about that clearly tells you people have some level of skepticism. This one, I won't run through it, but quickly look at the question in the white up there, and then you see the percentage and the number. Okay, I just got my tip. So again, telling you that we wanted to, as much as possible, give people the reason to give us what and how they thought about this. Few observations and some conclusion. Local state-led incentives or led activities, the provision of basic social services, including the adequate public services and electricity to drive compliance does not exist. So social services. When you don't have social services, the social contract theory issue we will be talking about, some of the other colleagues, will be very pertinent to see how you can boost this kind of engagement. Payment on property taxes outside of Monrovia, the capital, is mostly non-existent, with few citizens obliging or complying to pay only if it is a direct personal benefit to them. We got evidence that showed that state inability to provide the basic resources to maintain and support services delivery and function at the local level continue to serve as one of the reasons why people feel this will be another scam. Generally, the respondents concur that tax awareness has been created mainly because of the 50-50 scam. Again, whether the intention is good or not, they feel they are just giving all the education. Outside of income tax, respondents concur that property and real estate tax payment is uncommon in their community. There are some people, or most of the people, who haven't paid taxes in their life. So you should imagine what it needs to make somebody to want to pay tax. Perceived acts of corruption by civil servants as well as inadequate social services, again, creating doubt. There was a consensus among respondents that the centralized system, I spoke about that in Monrovia as a problem, hope and optimism remain high insofar as the 50-50 revenue sharing pilot is concerned. However, skepticism remains high that the deal or the pilot 50-50 is likely not to go because people have had similar experience with what we call the County Social Development Fund. Again, there's a correlation between the County Social Development Fund and this. So these are some of the recommendations we managed to put forth. Okay, I got a minute. Government needs to consider a one-stop digitalized tax payment location. It's a challenge. We're talking about a country that has no electricity in most rural communities. They have to consider what we call mobile payment. There's a need to review and consider the ambiguity around inheritance law, especially if you want women to contribute constructively to this shame. The efficiency in tax collection should go beyond radio awareness, clearly because people are still having some difficulties understanding whether it's only done to attract people data. The devolution of power and authority is essential. However, to contribute to this, it will require political will and commitment by those who have the policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Abdul, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I will do this presentation based on a desk review that we did on Senegal, and I try to expand it to the Sahel, like Mali and Niger, etc. And I think it's important to stress the fact that if we talk about how political authority tax is established, we need to stress the fact that in Francophone countries, we are at least have the Napoleon Code, because we are like French colonies. So as we always said, our constitution are imitated from the French constitution, and then also our tax code is mostly based on the French model. I think that it's important to stress that fact. This said, I will try to present some of the patterns on taxation that I found on my desk review in Senegal, and I try to address also the challenges that are lying on, beside these patterns. Okay. So one first pattern that is, I think, is a pattern and a challenge too, is that the economic landscape in Senegal and most of the Sahel is characterized by informal sector. It's a very strong pattern in the economic landscape. So we have a few studies that try to understand the behavior of Senegalese informal sector. Why it's important to address it here, because the magnitude of the phenomena vis-a-vis the taxation policy is important, because it's a huge sector in the economy, but so far the type of legislation we have on taxation is not able to address this sector, to apply to this sector. That's important to say. So what we have in Senegal is we have what is called the single global contribution, meaning that all small businesses, for example, they have this only one payment they do annually to the general direction of taxation. So it's based on this law that was adopted in 2004. So this general global contribution include income tax, VAT, patent, license contribution, etc. So why they did it is just to avoid to have multiple payment, because if you have to face multiple payment, perhaps the taxpayer some of the taxpayers will try to avoid to pay, etc. So that's why they adopted this single payer mechanism. So when we were doing this, I was doing this desk review, I found out this study that was showing that the tax that unregistered firm should have to pay represent only 3% of total turnover. So the question is, since this amount is very small, why there is this persistence of informality? I think it's something that needs to be addressed. Why people are still staying in this informality. So there is a different hypothesis that we can see. So to stress the importance of the informal sector, I was consulting the National Agency for Statistics and Demographics, and it showed that 48 of the employed labor forces, and its value is estimated to 41.6 of the GDP. So these revenues are coming from the informal sector. So it means that it's very important for the Senegalese economy. And in Dakar, Dakar is the capital of Senegal. In Dakar by himself, the contribution of the informal sector to the GDP is estimated almost 10%. So it reflects the importance of here the sector in the national economic activity. So talking about the informal sector, we see that it occupies a very important place in the economy of developing countries. That's where I will expand to the country in the Sahel, because this characteristic that we see in the Senegalese economy can be applied to the Malian economy or the Niger economy, etc. So you have different type of smaller jobs like street vendors, etc., who are falling into this informal sector. So there are two opposing theses here to explain the high level of informality. One of them is the lack of information on the part of agents in the informal sector, meaning that they don't know where to pay, how much to pay, why they should pay taxes, etc. The second hypothesis is showing that there is a deliberate decision by entrepreneurs based on essentially on a rational strategy of cost minimization. The higher the turnover, the less likely the informal entrepreneur is to register his activity. So I think that because on the FRAC tax project, we will have to do some fieldwork in Mali. I think we have to take into consideration this kind of hypothesis and try to apply it when we do like field work in Mali. So after the informal sector, there is also another challenge. A challenge and also a pattern that we see in the Senegalese cases is the trust in institution and tax incentive. So the challenge is how to build trust and demonstrate effective governance action. I think we discussed it this morning in our meeting, showing that there is a strong correlation between the trust and the ability or the propensity to pay for taxes. So if you look at here, I have to go back. Sorry. How? Oh, this way. Sorry. So I want to stress here the importance of the trust, because it has a strong relationship with the political will. I think the trust is citizens trust the institution if they trust, for example, the political will of the government, etc. So therefore, I try to establish this link between political will and tax policy. So meaning that the efficiency of the tax policy depends also on the political will of the government. To illustrate that, I come up with this on the desk review. For example, the Senegalese tax administration control procedures have always essentially targeted businesses whose turnover and profitability are large enough to contribute significantly to tax revenue. Meaning that there is this choice, it's a political choice done by the government of Senegal and not trying to tax, for example, all actors who are involved in the informal sector, etc. And this is a kind of a lack of interest for informal activities, economic activities by the tax authorities. And this kind of trend is something that we found in what this organization called West Africa Economy and Monetary Union, where Senegal is a member and Mali, where we will do field work, is also a member. So also the challenge of fair taxing is becoming a strong and wide trend in West Africa. Here I'm trying to expand based on the Senegalese case. I try to now expand to the Sahel and show that some of the trends that we found in the Senegalese tax system is some of the debate that we also found in the Sahel country. For example, here, the issue of fair taxing is something that today, if you look at a social network, for example, young people in most West African countries are always debating about how taxing, for example, multinational companies is something that is very, let's say, urgent and something that can help, for example, this economy to move forward, etc. And also, natural resources exploitation and taxation is one of the major issues in the political agenda, especially for opposition parties. It's also a trend that we found in Senegal, in Mali, etc. I want to illustrate it by using one of the cases in Senegal. You have a very young leader who is now, let's say, the leader of the opposition in Senegal. All his narrative is based on taxation, fair taxation. And he has he was a tax official. He worked at the direction of tax revenue as a high rank official. But he was removed from the Senegalese civil services because of the type of narrative he has in contesting the performance of the tax system that is today performing in Senegal. So I think it's a very interesting case because he's followed by a lot of young people in Senegal, but also in the neighboring country. And this kind of narrative is something that we can find also in Mali, etc. I give this example because today he is becoming the challenger of the current president for the 2024 election. And most of his narrative is based on showing how to improve the taxation system. And that's how he became like, let's say, somebody who is trying here to tell the truth, his view as some type of vigilante for Senegalese population who is spoiled by the current system, etc. This is the type of narrative they're using. So I think his story is interesting because it started with a union that they created inside the administration of tax revenue. The union was created, and after they tried to dismiss the union with a strong opposition of the prime minister, etc. This data, I took it from a newspaper that did like a special focus on this issue in 2016. So basically what I want to show here is today there is this mainstream narrative about economic patriotism. You know, we need to regain our sovereignty in our natural resources, etc. And therefore, to regain this sovereignty in our natural resources means that we need to have a more performing tax system that will target, for example, some of the natural resources that are exploited by multinational, etc., etc. So here I just quote one of the French journal who said that his image as a man of integrity fiercely opposed to enrichment on the back of the population of a political class judged to be corrupt, etc. So it shows, what I want to show here is how much taxation has took a very strong, robust place in the political agenda in Senegal and in neighboring countries like Mali, etc. So tax sensitization is something also a major trend. We see in most Sahel country and in Senegal, we have, for example, some type of campaign pushing, advocating for people to pay taxes, etc. We saw some ads on the TV, and this is something that is already also happening in Mali, etc. Here, the rhetoric about fair taxation on natural resources, I already talked about that. It's something widely shared among political parties in the Sahel and civil society organization. We have, like today, in the Sahel and some civil society organization who are trying to play like watchdog on how this taxation on natural resources is done, etc. I will go quickly because I think my time is up. But basically what is important here to stress is intrinsic link between tax collection capacity and state legitimacy. I think that's where I will conclude. There is a strong link between these two. If the more the state has a strong legitimacy, the more the political authority to establish and operate tax will be stronger. Thank you.
I have a long presentation. I'll make sure it's okay. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. And today I'm going to be talking about basically taxation and state building in the context of a fragile state like Afghanistan. And my presentation is very much a reflection of my PhD research that I did on Afghanistan. So what I'm going to be talking here today, is it? Yeah. So I'm going to be talking about initially about my analytical framework and the approaches that I used, and then I'll talk about some of my research findings, both historically and mainly in post-Afghanistan, and of course, now what is the status of taxation under the Taliban and what their future prospects hold. So based on the analytical framework, I very much build upon two key approaches. So it is basically the liberal view of taxation, or what we call them the good governance agenda. But of course, I do go to the literature on state building, drawing upon Tilley's and European experience of classic endogenous state building. But my thesis is very much challenging the liberal view of state building, and I'm not going to be going through what the good governance agenda or liberal view of state building is, because I'm sure you guys know it better than I do. So what my PhD is very much focused about the political economy model. And why it challenges the liberal view? Because there are several reasons, obviously. First of all, it's a very universalized template and does not work in the context of every country universally. It is very much a donor's prescriptions, very much influenced by IMF and that of the World Bank. And of course, it doesn't take into account the complexities of the power configuration, the role of political settlement, and how power is configured. So, and when I talk about the political economy model, I very much focus about two frameworks. So, namely political settlement, that is very much, I reflect upon Mushtaq Khan's argument about political settlement, and then obviously Douglas North theory about the limited access order. On the political settlement, so my key argument, I draw upon the definition of political settlement, how power and resources are basically distributed, organized, and mainly the institutional arrangement that sustain that kind of settlement, or that kind of arrangement. So political settlement is not basically one-time agreement or an elite pact in the country. So and on the limited access order, basically I talk very much about the role of, rents are created in those sort of societies for the powerful political elites so that they do not engage in violence but come into a peace agreement with the state. And when applying political economy model of taxation, so basically I apply it in the context of taxation. So I argue that the state capacity to tax is influenced very much by how power is configured, how power is distributed, shared, the balance of power. And I argue, and my focus is mainly about these tax lowering, tax exemptions, and systematically tolerating the tax holidays for powerful elites. And then obviously the elite bargains, rent seeking, rent negotiations, and on these sort of things. And finally, when you talk in the context of countries like Afghanistan, you cannot ignore the role of international actors, the role of aid, exemptions, and off-budget, these sort of things. Now, talking to my research findings, basically, my main argument is that taxation and state building relation has been influenced by by the interaction between three complex factors. They are the political settlement, which I talk about, power configuration, rent seeking, elite bargains, the changing taxation policies, and obviously the role of international actors or the role of aid. So if I just go a little bit of the history, given the limited amount of time I have, so I won't be able to go through each of them, but I try to be as brief and as short as possible. So Afghanistan history, at least in the past 200 years, have been very much influenced by the interaction between these three factors. So if you look at the very early rulers of Afghanistan, Sadozai, it was a confederation of tribes and Khanids or Khans, basically. And at the time, war making of Indian subcontinents was the source of friend creation between, for the elites, powerful elites at the periphery. So that's why the kind of settlement that was sustained was because of those conquests. But after the loss of the territories in early 19th century, as those conquests, as those territories were lost, there was no source of revenues for those powerful elites at the periphery. So that kind of settlement that was forged before was disrupted. And here is the role of international British intervention that comes into play. And then Afghanistan emerges as a buffer state between the rivalry between the Russia and the Indian British of its time. When Abdurrahman Khan comes to power, basically we experience the same sort of relationship. However, he disrupts the nature of political settlement. He imposes taxes on landowners, and whatever tax exemptions that the political elites were enjoying in the past, he gets them cancelled, gets them stopped, and he very much uses religion as a source of legitimacy to taxing people, and then he uses his very, very coercive nature of taxation. And then there is resistance at the time, but since he was in receipt of British subsidies, all the rebellion gets suppressed. When Amanullah comes, so this is when Afghanistan gains its independence in 1919. Independence has been costing Afghanistan to lose the British subsidy because we got the independence from Britain. So the British subsidy that Abdurrahman Khan was in receipt of gets cut off. And as a result of this, Amanullah relies more on domestic taxation. So, and Afghanistan taxes at the time is the only ever, or the Afghanistan fiscal budget is the only ever surplus that Afghanistan has experienced, and that's because of the nature of taxation and that Amanullah Khan pursued. However, taxation gets resisted, and since Amanullah was not in receipt of British subsidy, so he cannot suppress the resistance, and a result of which his government collapses. And then Musahiban, learning from the experience of Amanullah Khan and Abdurrahman Khan, Musahiban very much follow a very conservative nature of political settlement, not challenging the powerful elites at the periphery. And as a result of this, what happens to the taxation, tax revenue for the government becomes low, and it barely makes it 7% of GDP at a time. Musahiban very much looks like Karzai's era, which I will talk shortly. And then PDPA and the Soviet-backed government. So there is a bit of difference between the two factions of the PDP, the Khalqi rulers and the Parchamis. The Khalqi was, their nature of political settlement was very much fractured, and it was divided between ethnic and linguistic lines. And they pursued very radical transformation, just like what we see now in Taliban's time. But when Parchami rulers come in, they follow very much Musahiban's, what we call them encapsulation and co-option of the periphery. And one of the reasons was because they were in receipt of aid, so that's why they didn't bother to tax. And that's why a limited access order has been maintained, but with the cost of the taxation. So PDP taxation was very, very low. And then the Civil War era, the Mujahideen time, it was very much a fragmented political settlement, shaky. The country was ruled by several power brokers in different eras. So this time, because of the conflict, taxation was very much fragmented as well. And whoever in the periphery were kind of controlling the economic streams, or namely the custom revenue, they would generate revenues. And when Taliban came, so basically Taliban pursued a very exclusive, overly centralized political settlement. They stopped any redistribution to powerful elites at the periphery, and their government and their cabinet was purely exclusive, very much just like what we see now, purely mullahs, religious leaders with no background, no technocratic background, and also there was a very informal budget system. It's interesting, Mullah Umar, who at the time had a trunk full of cash under his bed that he would use to pay for his insurgent groups. And then, so taxation was very much Islamic, you know, those 5 types of Islamic, ushur, zakat, that I'm not going to be talking about that. And then, of course, here they were in receipt of aid from some countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and UAE. Okay. Now coming to Karzai post-ban Afghanistan. Post-ban Afghanistan, when Karzai came to power, in early days, there was a strategy of institutionalization. There were efforts for building the administrative, the taxation system of the government. And there were a lot of reforms have done at a time. And as we can see, the ratio of GDP grew from revenue GDP ratio increased from 4.6 to 8.4%. And obviously, international has had a very paramount role because there was a huge flow of aid in the country. ARTF, Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, was managing the flow of aid, and there were PRTs, Provincial Reconstruction Team, in every province that they were helping a lot. So, and that's why taxation system, as you can see, has increased and has improved at a time. However, after 2009, the relationship between Karzai and the US gets tensed, and as a result of this, the strategy of institutionalization that were pursued during early days of post-ban Afghanistan stops, and there is a deinstitutionalized strategy, and Karzai very much relies more on peripheral, powerful elites as opposed to building up the institutions and these sort of things. So technocrats get marginalized, and there is a very big shift from power to local elites, to local commanders, and this sustained what Douglas called limited access order or relative order, but at the cost of taxation. So the tax bargaining that it was going on in the first round gets stopped, and as a result of this, you can see that except 2012, tax revenue to GDP started to shrink, and it shrank from 10.8% to 8.5%. So, and of course, there is the aid impact as well. Aid was flowed through off the budget, and it was also very much helping the powerful elites at the periphery. And just because of the time, I don't want to go into each specific element. So when Ghani came, so people call him, he was more of a minister of finance than a president. He was the minister of finance in the early days, so he was kind of acting like a finance minister again when he became the president. So taxation comes at the forefront of his attention, and there is a lot of efforts to improving the taxation system. Income taxation, which is very much core for income tax and corporate tax, which is the core of building a fiscal social contract. And I think this is some credits that can go to Ghani at the time, that he did manage to increase the revenue from 8.5% to 13.4%, unprecedented in the history. However, the conflict was ongoing. Taliban were advancing, and the international dimension you cannot ignore. The aid stopped to decrease, and then the Doha talks at the same time happens, where Taliban have been given more rooms, more space. Ghani's government gets sidelined, and that's why it eventually led to the collapse of his government. But one thing important to note is that this is the relationship between taxation and political settlement. He basically overly centralized power, and he weakened all these powerful political elites at the periphery who could potentially fight the Taliban at the time. But you can see the resistance level in those periphery was very, very low, and Taliban immediately, particularly in the north, where there was no resistance against the Taliban. And finally, Taliban now, which I call them Taliban too, when they came to power last year in August, I see no difference between Taliban 2 and Taliban 1. They pursued the same sort of political settlement, exclusive political settlement. Mainly, their government or de facto government is consisted of the mullahs, Pashtuns, women have got no rule, overly centralized sort of power, no distribution of rents that were the practice during Gaza in particular. So, of course, they pursue some taxation policy as opposed to their first rule. They reduced taxes on income. They relied more on, again, customs revenue. They argue that the level of corruption has been reduced, which is correct to some extent. However, it is subject to question because the level of transparency that you see there in their government is very much badly impacted upon the freedom of speech, the freedom of media, can't do anything. And there were reports that in the passport department, for instance, many of their officials were corrupt. So when they can't handle passport department, which is very close to their office, how could they do that in the periphery? Of course, they managed to generate like 400 million in the very first 3 reports based on a report by USEP, US and United States Institute of Peace, which is around 1.6 million. But all of these is revenue generated from customs revenue. Income tax, which is core for establishing a social contract, is still absent there. And of course, aid money has also been cut off. Afghanistan foreign reserves have been cut off. There was some growing optimism, but given the fact that they did not untie their relationship with Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri case, the picture we see is very, very dark for the future. And that's why there are some figures. I don't want to go through them. Food security. Even if you compare this from their first rule to the second rule, food security, for instance, insecurity, it was 62% pre-2001 when they were in power, and now it is 92%. Children under 5 malnutrition rate was 9%, now it is 50%. And poverty rate is, of course, very high. Women's rights, as you know, is heavily restricted. And what I argue is there's a kind of stagflation in the country. You know, stagflation is a situation where inflation is very high, and at the same time, unemployment is very high. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And can we lift this one? And I will invite the panelists to come up. Joseph as well, please. Have a seat. Please, let's, in the time that we have remaining, try to kick off a discussion. So, Joseph, please, what does this sound like? I mean, when you think about what you have heard based on your experiences with these issues in Tanzania. And in order for us to have a discussion, I have to ask you to be relatively brief.
Okay, thank you so much.
It's on.
Actually, I don't think if there is a standard format on how to comment, but I will just try to summarize my points under 4 headings. Briefly, I will give a brief background on the importance of resource mobilization in fragile states. And then I will try to share experience of Tanzania because, as you have said, Tanzania is slightly different in terms of tax performance when compared to some of the selected fragile states. I'm not sure how different is it, but it is said so, and there is a literature which supports that one, that it is doing slightly better compared to other fragile states. I will just pick some few areas which have been cited by the presenters, and I'll try to show how is Tanzania differently handling those issues. But also, I will point on some few breaking points which have featured in the presentation. And I think it will mark the end of my comment. As we all know, the challenge facing most fragile states, irrespective of its location, whether they are in Africa or elsewhere in the world, is the ability to mobilize resources from domestic sources, not only to mobilize resources, but to mobilize resources from domestic sources. And the consequences of this failure are many and obvious and detrimental to the governments of these countries. Failure to mobilize resources have many effects. If you are unable to mobilize resources, it is definitely you will not be able to finance, to provide basic needs to your people. You will not be able to finance development projects. You will not be able to do almost everything which is important to your society. As such, it will compromise the role of the governments of these states to play their key functions or to play their role as free states. This is to say, it is very important that these countries should think on how can they get out of that trap. How can they move forward? How can they address that situation? And the only way is through improving resource mobilization from domestic sources. Tanzania has undergone extremes in the sense that there are ups and downs. Immediately after independence in 1961, the economy of the country was centrally controlled economy. It was some kind of socialism. It was controlled by the state, and actually there was no money because it was the time when the country had to build a lot of infrastructure because it was the time when to go to the independence. We had a very good president, but he was not luck. So the government had to incur a lot of public debts. It used it to borrow a lot of money. After that one, the free economy was introduced in the 80s, and it is from this period when we experienced some kind of laissez-faire approach in which almost the economy was about to collapse. People were doing business without paying tax. I mean, the economy was completely unregulated. Thank God, after that one, another president who came introduced administrative approach which rescued the economy, although it had its problems as well, because it was at this period when privatization took place. And we all know privatization has its good sides and bad sides. All the public enterprises were privatized, and it is very unfortunate that they were privatized, some of them free of charge. The enterprises which were making profit, they were privatized just free of charge, others at a very cheap price. Thereafter, again, it became a regime, another regime which was slightly unregulated, but things were not worse than the previous. Then another phase which was very strict, and it was some kind of authoritarian type of leadership, came in and rescued the economy. It's when Tanzania became the middle income level. And now we have a regime which is not very different from the previous one. So by virtue of that one, people are looking Tanzania on a positive way. In the presentation, they were trying to point out the factors which may shape the taxation system of a country. They mentioned something about the informal sector, the management of property tax. Abdul mentioned about the management of tax incentives, and also Issa mentioned about exemptions. In Tanzania, we have shared with my colleagues sometimes the management of property tax. I think there is a lesson there. Previously, it was under the control of the local government authorities, and it was the main source of government revenue to the local authorities. I don't know what happened, but the government took it from the local government authorities, and local government authorities were left with very small and unreliable. We call them problematic types of incomes. They are complaining, of course, but the government took the property tax. But management of it was a problem. Administration of it was a problem. Now, it has recently now introduced a system in which the level of compliance when it comes to collection of property tax is highly enhanced. No one is able to escape paying property tax because it is digitalized in such a way that it is tied, it is attached to the utility. So when you consume, you buy electricity, automatically you will find yourself paying a property tax. Actually, it is allocated on yearly basis. So no possibility, no chance of compliance, because we have seen compliance is a problem also in African countries. As far as informal sector is concerned, informal sector we know is very big. There are people who are saying informal sector should not be taxed because it's where majority of the poor are working. But according to the principle of taxation, everybody who has income should pay tax. And Tanzania has recognized that one and has introduced a system in which a flat rate, a very small amount, whoever is doing an informal business is required to pay that particular amount of money, and he will be given an identity card to show that he has contributed. A very small amount which people are not complaining. The issue of tax incentives, it is a problem in our country. There are a lot of incentives because we have the mining, multinational companies working in mining and in other sectors, export processing zones. They are not paying tax, and actually the bad thing is they are abusing. So taxation of these multinationals is a problem. And this will suggest that there are reasons now to rethink about either minimizing or eradicating it completely. I don't see the rationale for granting tax incentives if all other incentives are available. So it is debatable, of course, because investors, the only advantage they are bringing is employment, but there is something, there is political issue there. Yeah. So to get it out completely is difficult, but the common sense will suggest that there is no reason to continue granting tax incentives for investors who would have come even if there were no tax incentives. For example, if it is mining, we have diamond. If diamond is not available anywhere, why should you grant someone a tax incentive to convince him to come to invest in a diamond sector which is not found anywhere? There are no reasons for that one. And it is contributing to a loss of government revenue. At the same time, we are thinking on how to mobilize resources. There is this concept of political will. It is a problem. I don't know, maybe the participants will share. But political will, how do you instill political will? Politicians themselves are somewhat a problem. So the issue of political will as a way to increase, say, compliance, as a way to improve mobilization is a bit challenging because it is something personal. I don't know how to put it, but it is difficult according to my view. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. We don't have that much time remaining, but I just want to sort of throw a few questions to the panelists, and then we'll see if there is some, also we have the time for some other responses. But some of the key takeaways here is, I mean, first is this issue, I mean, you were talking about this, Jimmy, the issue of trust. How to re-establish trust in a state where dysfunctionality and corruption has been so ingrained for so many years. So that how do one work on that particular issue? Seen from your perspective as both a researcher and an intellectual, but also as a CSO operative in your institution. I mean, how can one work on that issue? I mean, even a extremely well-meaning government in Liberia would have a huge challenge in this, because why should people suddenly start trusting a government that never really could have been trusted in history?
Yeah.
Hold on.
Oh, okay.
Abdul, I mean, I think that your example on Usman Sanko, I mean, who's sort of gone from being a relatively young, sort of aspiring bureaucrat working in tax collection to becoming sort of the, how should I say, the youth opposition leader is immensely interesting and points to sort of an ongoing trend in West Africa's Sahel, and that is that a new generation of young leaders are emerging. Some of them through the ranks of the military, others through the streets, others through all other kind of oppositional activity. But what is happening here, and is there a sort of some new youthful aspirations connected to the state, to state building, and thereby also to taxation and ideas about a new social contract? Is something like this sort of simmering on the horizon in Senegal, Sahel, beyond and beneath these headlines we see of jihadi insurgents, of mayhem and destruction? And to Isar, I mean, a great presentation, and I mean, a lot to take away from your sort of how the periodization you make of the history of really of the Afghan state. But I want you to try to sort of engage even more with where you ended, and that is, of course, with what you call Taliban too. Because how can one engage such a difficult regime? I mean, should one just leave it beside and say that, okay, this is what Afghanistan has for now, and the Afghan people just have to suffer the consequences of the fact that Afghanistan has produced something like Taliban, even though we all know that the Taliban is not something that was completely produced by Afghan and Afghanistans. So is it talking about sort of social contracts, taxation, is it meaningless in this kind of case, or is there still some entry points that can be used there to engage, if not the Taliban as such, but is there elements of the state that still can be engaged? Is it elements of Afghan society that can still be engaged? And not the least, is there some entry points for some sort of conversation with parts of the Taliban around some of the issues that they may be interested in? And I'm not now talking about the religion, but about, for example, trade. Because, I mean, if that's what they are left with, the trade routes, the marble, and these kind of things, is there some entry points that we can imagine here? You will not get much time, so I'll give you, I want to see if there are some responses from audiences as well, so I'll give you 1 minute each. Jimmy, 1 minute on trust.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a very important question, the question about trust. Again, bringing into fold the whole idea of the social contract between the citizenry and the state. Within the context of a fragile state, where trust level have eroded because of the fragmentation, of the polarization that have occurred, there needs to be a conscious attempt to sort of restore trust by some form of political will, and my colleague said he wouldn't understand in the general context, but that will of demonstrating commitment to what you have alleged or pledged to do, one era. Politicians are always making promises that they wouldn't honor in terms of the execution. And in the reconstruction process of countries, there are avalanche of services people want. Being ready to only tackle what you can deliver, and deliver that is one way. The other way is being accountable for whatever you have been given to both your community, your society, and the region. Being transparent. Be open. Let people see you through their aspirations. Let people see that leader as the one who want to lead them, because you are inclusive, you recognize that there's going to be no one left behind, and you are prepared to ensure that what is given to you, you will account for it. Trust will not be abstract, but with the little form of utilizing resources in a transparent and an accountable and a participatory manner, you can build trust.
Thank you. Abdul.
Thank you. I think your question, Morton, is very interesting because there is this, I think, like you said, there is this new generation of emerging leadership in West Africa. I think the way I explain it is perhaps there is a kind of perception first that West African population countries are dispossessed from what they have, assets like natural resources, etc. All these belonging assets are benefiting to other countries. And remember that you have a lot of you who have, they try to build their future, but they don't have any option. We work on migration in Agadez. We went to Agadez. You see all these young people who are trapped in the desert. So they don't have any hope. So this kind of frustration, I think, pushed some of the young people to think about how to reassess our sovereignty vis-a-vis other countries, etc., and how to repossess what belongs to us. This is the kind of rhetoric that you will find. And today, for example, you mentioned that among these leaders, there are civil, political leaders, but you have also military. For example, today, most of people are looking at Bamako, the young Assimi Goïta, who was able to confront France as one of the stronger, powerful country in West Africa. So I think these are some type of models that, I'm not saying that they are perfect. It's just that they are giving hope to this young new generation, a hope that there is a new type of leadership that can promote some type of self-determination, or I think this is the type of feeling that we have today.
Thank you. Isar.
Yeah, this question's engagement entry point with the Taliban, I think, has been a kind of question that has been going on around in the past 1 year. At the beginning, there was a level of optimism that, yeah, Taliban perhaps have changed. And at the beginning, they acted to show to the international community, not to the national level, that they have changed. Perhaps they have learned some diplomacy over the years. But we have seen over a year that they have not changed, unfortunately. They have even been worse than before. They promised to the international community and to people in Afghanistan that they will not have any ties with the terrorist group, Al-Qaeda. We have seen recently that the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was there. We live in the 21st century. I doubt where you will find one single case where women, girls, will not be allowed to go to study. Girls are not allowed to go to school. What kind of justification can you make for this, right? And it's not just not the women's rights. The human rights is highly violated, and the kind of policies that they are pursuing, overly centralized, overly exclusive. What is it creating? It is unfortunately creating resistance. And I can see that the number of resistance troops, there were around 3,000 at the beginning, and now I've heard that it is growing to 8,000. And I think day and day, it will grow up. The economy is in a precarious situation. They don't know how to govern, so how could you expect an entry point? And unfortunately, the future is dark for Afghanistan.
Basically what you're saying is that the war will continue.
Sadly to say, unless I doubt they will do anything to change or you can see they are divided in within, and the international community is not recognizing them. More importantly, the people are not recognizing them. And I think they have forgotten over the past 2 decades, Afghanistan has changed. And they have to recognize that. If you can see women, every day they are on the street. What does that reflect? That reflects that the people have changed. And you've got to recognize that. And if not, it will continue resistance. Today, it is more peaceful on the streets. Tomorrow, it will be more violent on the mountains, deserts, or elsewhere.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Stein, please.
There's a lot of things that should be said here, but I don't know how much time we have.
We are running out, so but we can take a couple of short ones.
Yeah. First, the taxation and trust issue. That's a bit of a chicken and egg dilemma, because how can you create trust if you have nothing to deliver on the one hand? And secondly, how can you deliver anything unless you've already had the resources from collecting taxes? So can you first create trust without already having the capacity, or do you first need to create the capacity in order to be able to build trust? And that's a fundamental dilemma, one could say, between creating legitimacy and creating capacity. And where to start and how that process can be managed is very difficult to say. The second point I wanted to bring out is that, as clearly brought out in the Afghanistan description, the question of taxation is closely related to issues of power. And in many countries, the dilemma is, as the Afghanistan, some of the different periods showed, that many times if a regime tries to build up tax collection capacity, they are met with resistance. And often they rely on the support of groups whose interests are threatened by increased tax collection, which means that if you try to increase tax collection, you undermine the basis of your own power. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem in most fragile states, if one generalizes about it. So the reason why they're in this trapped situation is that even if you get leaders who would like to improve state capacity and tax collection, they cannot, because they rely on support whose interests, the support of groups whose interests are being undermined if you increase tax collection.
Thanks, Stein. And that will leave us with the final things before you get your final 1 minute. So I suggest that we ask Jimmy and Abdul to sort of to try to respond to Stein's sort of chicken and egg comment on the trust issue, and then we leave the Afghanistan challenge from Stein to Isar. So Jimmy, please. Chicken and egg.
Well, I think the complexity of the problem has been hardly explained in the way you describe it. Question 2. But I will address it within the context of a fragile state. And it is because what led to the fragility of the state? The state collapsed as a result of exclusionary practices. Some of what he described as corruption, dysfunctional system, nepotism, tribalism, and all these things. So we know the factors that precipitated the problem, that gave rise to the problem. So after the state collapse, there's an expectation that the approach to a reconstruction of the state will take a new trajectory. So the trust we are talking about here is within the context of a fragile state, recognizing what were in existence and what trajectory we have to adapt to sort of change the status quo. And I think no one explains it better than Paul Collier, who talked about the issue of conflict trap, where if you don't address the issues that contributed to this sort of polarization, to war and conflict, you stand a chance of recollapsing. Hence the idea of fragility. So we're talking about doing things different rather than going back to the status quo. That's the trust factor we are looking at.
So what I can add is perhaps usually when, for example, there is a new power elected, there is what is called, I don't know how to say it in English, period de grâce is like a period where the new power has ability to take usually even unpopular measure. I think that could be the better period to try to experiment because you have already this popular support. For example, I'm referring to this young Senegalese leader today. What is interesting with him is usually, and it has to do with what you said, if you are supported by like private interests or people who have like own business, when you get to power, these people don't want you to raise the taxes. But in this case, what is interesting is he has the support of young people, for example. Most people who are, let's say, want to give the few that they have. Today, we have this political actor who is benefiting from the militant. Usually, in Africa, what happens is, if you are a political entrepreneur, you are the one who will find the money to make your campaign. But these young people, it shows the type of support that he has. It's the young people, even older people, who will give contribution voluntarily. So I think that it depends on the cases, but you can have like a context that is favoring you to take some bold measure on taxation because it's a short period, but you can profit from that short period. That's what I can give as answer. So.
Thank you, Abdul. And then Dr. Isar,
I'll try to make it short. Yeah.
you get the final word here, but please make it short.
Well, basically, the challenge between power, configuration, and taxation is not only the problem in Afghanistan and most of the developing world, as Douglas North argues in his book, Capital Coercion, Capital Coercion Legitimacy, and then the kind of setting. I agree that when you challenge rent-seeking opportunities from powerful elites, or you're basically allowing them more tax exemptions, you're basically giving them more tax holidays. That is the kind of the cost that will be there. But like what Douglas argues, that is the kind of, at the beginning and the first stage, which he calls them fragile limited access order. So moving from a fragile limited access order to a kind of open access order that we see is in the West, it's got many other stages. So we need to go to basic limited access order and then to mature limited access order, which he argues that you need this arrangement, informal arrangement, to sustain for a while so that the institutions are getting established. So in Afghanistan, we have never managed, even in Russia, China, they are not open access order. they are basically basic or mature limited access order, not open access order, because access to resources is not open, democracy is not there. So you need to give them time so that the institutions get established. Slowly, the role of informal power brokers get diminished, and then once the system is working, then it will work. But let's not forget, in the case of Afghanistan, there was continuous war going on, conflict going on, and there were the international dimensions that we can't forget, that the role of aid, the political marketplace theory of DeWaal. He argues that international community through aid kind of support informal rent-seeking, rent negotiation, that kind of undermines the system. But again, moving from a fragile limited access order to a mature limited access order and then to an open access order is not 1 decade, 2 decade journey. It needs time.
And with that, it takes time. Our time is over. So I would like to thank the panelists for their presentations and their insights, and those that followed online and those in the auditorium. Thank you all, and have a good afternoon in at least in Oslo, that is still has relatively pleasant summerly temperatures. So thank you all, and stay tuned for more from NUPI on this team and related teams. So thank you all.